So the first thing that I wanted to do was kind of look at it from the perspective of, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have a couple different browser windows here. So I already have a couple of Firefox windows open that we'll look at in a minute here. So I'm going to pop open IE. Now this particular demo site is registered at this www.gsdemo.com. Now, one of the things I wanted to do is a lot of people end up leaving the original PeopleSoft sign-on page out there. And in fact, let me go through and I'll pull up the original one that ships with PeopleSoft. And so basically, in a lot of cases, people send out the links into PeopleSoft and forget about the fact that a lot of people will, they'll just remember the name of the site that's being hosted and type it in themselves. So this is, I've just made a backup of this, but this is the original, when you run any PeopleSoft install, it actually just, it's not very friendly. And the other thing is that it actually, the link here is actually pointing to, the default demo site, but in a lot of cases, people don't have that. So if you even click on that, you basically get, nothing happening here. So what we've done is to go through, and we'd recommend this as best practice, is even in your root of, the index HTML file that is used here, if I go ahead and just hit the root level here, what we have is that's actually redirecting to the portal homepage here. Now here, I don't have single sign-on turned on in this environment. We wanted to kind of show some examples of we've done some examples before of where linking somebody into the portal homepage would take them directly in. What I wanted to do here is just to pull up really quick. What all we did is I've switched over here, and this is just a Notepad++ text editor. So this is the nice thing with it is that instead of using for folks that don't have a if you're not using some kind of a syntax highlighting text editor, this is one that's freely available that you can download, so we would definitely recommend doing that. So what you'll see here is that this is the original one that just has this redirection here. And what we've done is here I've gone ahead, and this is where I've gone through and updated this. Now all I've done here is basically just copy, putting in this thing here to go through. And all it does is just to go through and actually redirect somebody here to the portal homepage for this environment. So if somebody hits the root of the server, we make an assumption here. Now, if you happen to know that your common use cases is that people are getting into expenses or they're doing some particular place, you can change these links and direct people into deep links within PeopleSoft. Now, one of the interesting things is that as you've gone through, and if you have something that will log on people automatically, that's great. They'll just go straight in with bypassing that. The other thing, though, in the cases where you are, you're going to need to prompt people for their passwords here, one of the things that we have done here is you'll notice that now here in this case I left this error icon here, and I'd probably want to change that for production use. But one of the things that we did is that when you hit a link that's taking you into PeopleSoft and you're not logged on, it redirected us here and put in this, the command equals login. It also added this error code here. And unfortunately, the default error for PeopleSoft, when you just follow a link in, it says, your user ID and password are invalid. And what we've seen in talking to a lot of customers about this is that kind of freaks out untrained people because they didn't even try to log in yet. And so one of the things that you can do, and I've got this file open as well. So in your, got this error.properties here. This file here, this is another file that there's a couple of these files that part of the reason that they don't typically get updated is because they're physically deployed out to the web server at install time, and they're not something that are managed in the database. So what we've done here is to go through and just for folks that are following along or can't quite read that path there on the top, when this is in the portal web INF directory. And so there's some different language ones for this as well. So here we can go through and we can actually we actually change this message here that just say something, please put in a user ID and password. Now, another common thing that you may want to do in some of these messages or even on the logon page is to provide more information to people about like if you support the LDAP logon where people are using their Active Directory credentials, you can go ahead and, put something in there to indicate that. You see in a lot of cases, people don't, it just says user ID and password, that they don't, don't realize that, in the cases where you are sharing the network credentials, that they don't need to have something that's specific to this application. So we would certainly recommend that from a best practice perspective, that anybody coming in and doing self-service shouldn't need to have an account inside of PeopleSoft. That should be something that can be shared with other applications as well. And most commonly, that would be your Active Directory logons. Obviously, in the cases where you are pushing out, like supply chain self-service or something like that, where they're not employees or other people that would be in your internal Active Directory, it's still a probably good idea to look at, having another external authentication server to handle that. So that way, if you do have other applications that are exposed to the same customers, you can go through and keep that consistent. So for folks that are interested more on that, definitely, I would recommend coming to some of our more detailed security webinars or talking to us about some of this offline. Now, one interesting thing here that you'll notice is that as we go through and kind of test out some of these things, one handy tip here is that you can go through, and if you want to just, in some of these things, you may not even know how to trigger the error itself in PeopleSoft. And so if you're curious about, what is this going to look like, one of the things you can do is literally just go in and edit this error message, the error code here in the URL. So if I want to change this to error code 109, and so of course, let me change that to 110 here, something that is completely different. I randomly picked something that has a similar error message. So the idea for doing this testing, though, is to really go through and look and say, what would happen if you've got these self-service users seeing this? I mean, to be honest, this illegal identity switch, I think this is, would probably be some, internal People Tools bug that is coming up. So the fact that that happens, from an end user's perspective, that's just going to freak them out. So we would certainly recommend going through and considering, changing some of these messages here to be a little bit more friendly. Now, the nice thing is that you as an administrator still have visibility into what sort of errors that people may be seeing here. So, for example, if you are curious about this, one of the things is that, and we'll talk a little bit more about access logging, but what you'll notice is that any errors that would be displayed to somebody, because these are in the URL, they're going to show up in your server access logs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second here. But that way you know what's going on in the system, and if there is some issue that needs to be looked at from a technical perspective, you can do that. But there's no point in freaking out the end users about that. Now let's go ahead and continue on here. What I want to do is let me switch over to Firefox, and there's a reason that I want to switch to Firefox here. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and sign out. And imagine if I went through and did that same link here. One of the reasons that I wanted to show this is that even for organizations where you've standardized on IE, and that's the common browser that's deployed, we would recommend for people that are involved in dealing with the self-service rollout and development of that. It's good to have some of the other browsers installed, and both from the perspective of being able to look and see how the pages look visually, but also because in a lot of cases there's different web development tools that you can use. So for example, in Firefox, if I went through and I said, it's nice that we say, enter a valid user ID and password, that's fine, but where is this ugly message this ugly icon here? I really don't want the user seeing that. That's pointless. Now, if I right-click on here, Firefox, there's a plugin for this called Firebug that gives me this inspect element here. So you can easily go in here, and this shows you. So if I didn't know where in that HTML file that sets up the logon page, where that was set up, it would be very easy for me. You can see that it highlights exactly where in this HTML file that image is coming from. And it even lets you do things like if I actually go through here and if I right-click on this, and let's just say that I just say delete this element. What does that look like? And now you can see, oh, gee, that looks much better. So this isn't something that we're going to spend a whole lot of time on here, just because this is, there's definitely a lot of, other things to cover. But we did want to at least point that out, that there are some decent tools that you can go through to kind of have a better understanding of where a lot of this generated HTML comes from, so that you can take better control over it when you're looking at what gets deployed out to people. Now, let's go through, and the next thing we want to talk about here, we mentioned the logging. So there's a couple different things to do from a logging perspective. So one thing is, and I'm gonna switch back here to our text editor. In the default setup for PeopleSoft, in the WebLogic setup, I have the WebLogic, this is the config.xml file here. In the default setup for WebLogic, I'm highlighting this part here where it starts showing the access logs. The default config when you run the PeopleSoft setup is not to have the logging on here. So one of the things that I've gone ahead and turned that on here just so that we actually have this. And in fact, if I were to go through here and let me open up the logs and kind of have an idea of what this looks like. So if we were to go through here and we see, let's open this PIA access log here. Now you can see, and I'm going to go ahead and we've got a ton of data in here, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, and you can see here's where we're going through and the different activity that we've just put in here. But for example, like I mentioned, we can actually see in here what these messages are. So here we can actually see what this, you can see this error code 115 and error 105, and so some of these different links that have shown up here. So that's a good thing to turn on. Make sure you have that data. It's very useful for being able to go through.